I was just standing there at the entrance to the ballroom of the Montgomery Grand Hotel, still holding onto my worn-out leather purse, when I heard it. Victoria, my son's fiancée, was right there in the middle of a group of bridesmaids, all of them in $1,000 dresses, champagne flutes in their hands. She turned her head, that flawless blonde hair of hers swishing just so, and said it loud enough for God and everybody to hear. The farm woman who smells like manure just arrived. Her friends just burst into these little tinkling laughs. One of them even covered her mouth, pretending to be polite, but her eyes were shining with that cruel kind of fun that petty people get from putting others down. Victoria didn't even turn all the way around to look at me. She didn't have to. She knew I'd heard every last word. In that moment, standing there in my simple charcoal gray dress that I'd bought at the Nordstrom in the city, I felt a hot wave of anger wash over me. But it wasn't from shame, honey. No, it was anger. A cold, controlled kind of anger. The kind you feel when someone underestimates you so completely they don't even bother to lower their voice. I looked around that enormous ballroom, at the Waterford crystal chandeliers I'd picked out myself 4 years ago, the Italian marble floor that cost $145,000 to install, the French silk curtains that were changed out every season. Every single inch of this place belonged to me, and that arrogant little girl, with her fake last name and her giggling bridesmaids, had no earthly idea who she'd just insulted. But let me back up a bit here, because for you to understand how things got to this ridiculous point, I need to introduce myself properly. My name is Margaret Hayes. I'm 62 years old, and up until that moment, my son Connor thought I was just a simple widow living off a pension on some old farm in rural Kentucky. He had no idea, not a single clue, that I owned the very hotel where he was celebrating his engagement. He didn't know I had an investment portfolio worth over $5,200,000, and he sure as heck didn't know that the investment fund he was so proud of building all by himself, that $385,000 he loved to mention in conversations, had been created and managed by me from the very first penny. To my Connor, I was just Mom. The woman who lived on that old farm that smelled of hay and leather, who spent her afternoons tending to the cattle, who wore worn-out boots and faded blue jeans. And listen, I loved that life. I loved every plank of that creaky wooden floor, every fence my late husband Robert had built with his own 2 hands, every single sunrise I watched from the porch with a hot mug of coffee. That farm was my sanctuary, the place where Robert and I raised our boy, where we built an honest, simple life. Robert died 7 years ago. A massive heart attack while he was fixing the barn roof. He was only 57. I remember that day like it was yesterday. It was 3 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon in July, the sun so strong the air was shimmering over the fields. I was in the kitchen fixing some iced tea when I heard the sound. A dull thud that just echoed. My heart started pounding before my brain even processed what it was. I ran outside and saw my husband lying there on the dirt ground perfectly still. The hay scattered all around him, the hammer still in his hand. The months after Robert passed, they were the darkest of my entire life. I'd just go through the days in a fog, tending to the cattle on autopilot, sitting at the kitchen table all by myself, sleeping on the couch because the bed just felt too big, too empty, suffocating. Connor came for the funeral, stayed for a week, and before he went back to Cincinnati, he told me he'd met someone special. A girl from a good family, he said. His eyes shining in that way only new love can make 'em shine. I saw how excited he was talking about her, and even with my heart broken over Robert, I was happy for my boy. He deserved to be happy. I didn't blame him for going back to his life. Connor was 24 then, with a promising career as an investment consultant, a whole future ahead of him. He offered to stay longer, but I told him I was fine, that he needed to live his life, and I really thought I would be fine, or at least that in time I'd learn how to be. It was about 3 months after the funeral that I opened the drawer of Robert's desk. I was looking for the death certificate, needed it for the probate, when I found an old shoebox tucked way in the back. Inside, there were papers, lots of them. Bank statements, receipts, little notes in Robert's small, neat handwriting. I sat there on the office floor, that box in my lap, reading page after page, and with every sheet I turned, my surprise just grew and grew. Robert, my simple husband, my countryman who wore the same pair of boots for 10 years straight, had left behind a whole lot more money than I ever imagined. The farm was paid off. There was a savings account with nearly $95,000. And there was something else. Some stocks Robert had bought way back in the 90s for some tech company nobody really knew about back then. Stocks that were now worth $425,000. I just stared at those papers, my hands shaken like a leaf in the wind. $425,000. It was more money than I'd seen in my entire life. And all of a sudden, sitting there on that cold wooden floor, an idea started to form in my head. An idea that was maybe a little crazy, but it just kept growing, taking shape. Why not invest this money? Why not learn to do what Robert had done? But more strategically, with more intention? I had time. Too much loneliness, really. I needed something to fill those empty days that just dragged on and on. In the months that followed, I threw myself into the world of investments with an intensity that surprised even me. I spent entire nights reading books on the stock market, watching YouTube videos about technical and fundamental analysis, taking online courses from universities that offered free content. I discovered I had a natural knack for seeing patterns, for spotting undervalued companies, for calculating risk. It was like solving a giant puzzle, and every piece that clicked into place gave me a sense of accomplishment I hadn't felt in months. For the first time since Robert died, I had a purpose again. My first big investment was in a renewable energy startup based in Tennessee that everyone on the market said was going to go bankrupt in 6 months. I studied their numbers for weeks, analyzed their cost structure, researched the solar energy market, and I saw something those Wall Street analysts didn't see. The company had solid government contracts that were going to pay off in about a year. The problem was just short-term cash flow, not long-term viability. I put in $30,000 when the shares were at $2.80 apiece. 6 months later, the company was bought out by a giant clean energy corporation. My shares were sold at $18 each. My return was $125,000. I was hooked, not on the money itself, though the money was nice, but on that feeling of control, of power, of using my mind in a way I never had before in my life. For 40 years of marriage, I'd been a wife, a mother, a homemaker. Good roles I loved with all my heart, but they'd never challenged my intellect like this. Now, at 55 years old, I was discovering I had a gift for business that had been lying dormant my whole life. In 2 years, I turned that initial $425,000 into $2.5 million. And then I saw the ad in the Kentucky Business Journal. The Montgomery Grand Hotel was for sale. It was a historic hotel in Louisville, built in 1928, with 120 rooms, 4 event halls, a restaurant that had won awards in the 60s but was now almost empty. The building was falling into decay, losing money every month, the owners desperate to get rid of what had become a bottomless money pit. They were asking for $3,100,000, but anyone with negotiating experience knew that price was just a wish, a highball guess. I drove down to Louisville on a Saturday morning to see the place. The second I walked into that lobby, with its sky-high ceiling, its dusty but still beautiful stained glass windows, the cracked but still elegant marble floor, I felt it. This place had potential. It had good bones, as we say in the country about cattle. It needed investment. It needed care. It needed someone who could see what it could be instead of what it was in that moment of neglect. I made an offer of $2,300,000 cash, no financing. The owners accepted in 4 days. Connor didn't know a thing. He'd call every now and then, ask how I was doing, tell me about his job, about the new girlfriend he was getting to know. On one of those calls, I mentioned casually that I'd bought a hotel. There was a pause on the other end of the line, one of those long, strange pauses, and then he laughed. He thought I was joking, making some kind of joke he didn't quite get. He asked me if I was feeling okay, if I wasn't too lonely out on the farm. I didn't push it. I let him believe what he wanted. It was just easier that way, you know? Over the next 3 years, I transformed the Montgomery. I hired an exceptional manager named James Brennan, a 38-year-old man who'd worked at the Four Seasons for 12 years and knew everything about luxury hospitality, from team management to guest experience. James and I became partners in the truest sense of the word. He handled the day-to-day operations, managed the staff, made sure every guest had a flawless stay. I handled the finances, the long-term strategy, the investments in renovations and marketing. We talked every single day on the phone, reviewed weekly reports, made decisions together on everything. We renovated every single room, replacing old furniture with quality pieces, fixing leaky old plumbing, installing modern, quiet air conditioning systems. We completely updated the restaurant, hiring a young, talented chef from Indianapolis who brought in a contemporary menu with local, organic ingredients. We invested heavily in digital marketing, created a beautiful and functional website, and started appearing on lists of the best hotels in the region. The Montgomery became what it had been in the 20s and 30s, the most elegant hotel in Louisville, the place where the city's important families held their parties, where couples came for special anniversaries, where executives stayed when they came to do business in the capital. And the best part? The hotel was making a profit. A good profit. In our third year of operation under my management, the Montgomery generated $520,000 in net profit. Added to my other investments, my net worth had surpassed $5,200,000. Meanwhile, my life on the farm looked exactly the same to anyone who visited. I woke up at 5:30 in the morning, just like I had for 40 years. I took care of my 5 head of cattle, fed the chickens, fixed fences when they needed it. I had coffee on the porch, watching the sun rise over the fields Robert had loved so much. But then, I'd go into the office I'd set up in the old guest room and spend the day managing investments, reviewing hotel reports, joining video conferences with James, making decisions that moved hundreds of thousands of dollars. At night, I'd go back out to the porch with a glass of red wine, watch the sunset paint the sky orange and pink, and nobody, absolutely nobody in the county knew who I really was underneath that simple appearance. It was about 5 years ago that I created the fund for Connor. He'd just gotten his job as an investment consultant in Cincinnati. He was excited, full of plans for his career. In one of our phone calls, he mentioned that he wanted to start investing but didn't have much seed money to get started right. I heard that and had an idea on the spot. What if I gave him a little push? Not a direct gift, because Connor was too proud to take charity from his mother, but something he could believe was his own merit. I transferred $60,000 to an investment account in his name, through a legal structure that made it look like the money came from a trust from Robert's inheritance. Technically, it wasn't a lie. Since the original money had come from Robert, it had just grown a whole lot in my hands before it got to Connor's. I started managing that account just like I managed my own investments, picking stocks carefully, diversifying across different sectors, buying low and selling high. Connor got the monthly statements in the mail, saw the numbers growing month after month, and assumed it was the result of the decisions he thought he was making. It never occurred to him to question why his choices were so consistently successful when most beginners lose money in their first few years. He just believed he was good at it. A natural talent, you know? And I never corrected him. I let him have that pride, that confidence. I thought I was doing a good thing, giving my son the self-esteem he needed to grow in his career. The fund grew and grew. In 4 years, I turned that initial $60,000 into $385,000. And Connor? Connor thought he was a financial genius. He started giving opinions on investments at his job, speaking with an authority that came from the genuine belief that he knew what he was doing. He started subtly bragging to his friends about his portfolio, his strategies, how good he was with money. And when he met Victoria Sterling 2 years ago, he bragged to her too. He told her about the $385,000 he'd built on his own, about how he understood the market, about how disciplined and smart he was with investments. I should have seen it then, that something was wrong. Should have noticed the signs that started to pop up. But I was so happy to see my son in love, so relieved he'd found someone after years of relationships that never went anywhere, that I didn't pay close enough attention to the things that should have been red flags from the very beginning. The first time I met Victoria was a 1.5 years ago, on a Sunday in May. Connor called me during the week, saying he wanted to bring his girlfriend to see the farm, to finally meet his mother. I was thrilled. I spent all day Saturday cleaning the house from top to bottom, fixing a special lunch. I made a pot roast with potatoes and carrots, the recipe Connor had loved since he was a boy. I made a homemade peach pie with peaches from my neighbor's orchard. I set the table real pretty, with the embroidered linen tablecloth I only used for special occasions, the porcelain dishes that had been my grandmother's. When Connor's car pulled up the dirt drive that Sunday at noon, I was on the porch, wiping my hands on my apron, nervous in a way I hadn't been in years. Victoria got out of the car, wearing a white linen dress that probably cost more than my food budget for the whole month, high-heeled sandals that started sinking into the dirt path the second she stepped off the gravel, and enormous sunglasses that covered half her face. She looked around, taking in the old barn with its peeling paint, the wooden fence that had needed a new coat for 3 years, the chickens pecking freely in the yard, the old tractor parked near the shed. And I saw it. I saw the look that crossed her face before she could control it. Pure disdain. She thought all of it was beneath her, primitive. She came up the porch steps and held out her hand to me, her fingers delicate, her nails in a perfect, flawless French manicure. She greeted me politely, told me it was a pleasure to meet me, that Connor talked so much about the farm. But the way she was looking around while she talked, like she was sizing everything up and finding it all lacking, I couldn't ignore that. Lunch was tense from start to finish. Victoria barely touched her food. She took tiny portions of salad and said she was watching her carb intake, getting ready for wedding season in the summer, and needed to stay in shape. She kept checking her phone under the table, discreetly, but I could see it plain as day. She was answering texts, clearly bored out of her mind with an afternoon on the farm, counting the minutes until she could leave this backward place. After lunch, Connor offered to show her the cattle. I stayed in the kitchen starting on the dishes, and even from inside, through the open window, I could hear their conversation near the fence. Victoria said something about how hard it must have been for Connor to grow up in such an isolated place, so different from the life he had now in the city. Connor laughed, a little awkwardly, trying to play it off like it was no big deal. And then Victoria said something that made my blood run cold. "At least you got out of here. Imagine if you had stayed like your mother. No offense, but it must be so limiting to live like this." Limiting. She thought my life was limiting. I gripped the edge of the sink so hard my knuckles ached from the pressure. I took a deep, slow breath, forced myself to let go and keep washing the dishes, my hands trembling just a little. That girl knew absolutely nothing about me, about my life, about the choices I'd made. She didn't know that at that very moment, while she was looking down her nose at my simple ranch, I had more money in the bank than her entire family probably did. She didn't know I owned a hotel worth millions, that I managed a complex investment portfolio, that I'd built a fortune from scratch over the last 7 years without anyone even noticing. And more importantly, she clearly wasn't good enough for my son. But Connor was blind, head over heels in love. When they left that afternoon, he called me from the road, still on his way to Cincinnati, to tell me what a wonderful day it had been, how Victoria had loved the farm, how she'd found it all so authentic and charmingly rustic. I listened to him talk, heard the happiness in his voice, and I didn't correct him. I just said it was great to meet her too, that she seemed like a very nice young woman. What else could I do? Tell my son his girlfriend had insulted me? That she'd looked at our home with contempt? He wouldn't have believed me. Or worse, he would have thought I was being overprotective, jealous, trying to get in the way of his happiness. So I swallowed it. I tucked it away deep inside and went on with my life, like always. The months passed slowly. Connor called regularly, told me how the relationship was progressing, how wonderful Victoria was, how her parents had been so welcoming to him. The Sterlings this, the Sterlings that. Her family had a house on Martha's Vineyard. Her father had a successful financial consultant firm in Seattle. Her mother organized charity dinners for all sorts of important causes. They were, in my son's words, exactly the kind of family he'd always admired. And every time he said that, every time he talked about the Sterlings with that tone of reverent admiration, I felt a deep pang. A pang of hurt, of inadequacy. What were we then? Me and Robert, who'd raised him with all our love, who'd worked to the bone to give him a good education, who'd sacrificed vacations and luxuries to pay for his college. Weren't we enough? Weren't we worthy of admiration? But I never said a word about it. I just listened, agreed, said I was happy for him. And then, 8 months ago, he called me on a Wednesday night, his voice just overflowing with emotion, barely able to contain his excitement. He'd proposed to Victoria. He'd taken her to a fancy restaurant in Cincinnati, gotten down on one knee with a ring that cost him 4 months' salary, and she'd said yes right away. My son was engaged. I should have been happy. I should have cried tears of joy, like mothers do when their sons announce their engagements. But all I felt was a knot in my stomach, a feeling that something was wrong, even though I couldn't put my finger on what it was. It was just a gut feeling, you know? The kind of thing you can't explain, but it's just there, bothering you. But I didn't let any of that show. I congratulated my son, told him I was so happy for him that I couldn't wait for the wedding. And Connor, still on cloud 9, told me about the plans. The Sterlings wanted to throw the engagement party at the Montgomery Grand Hotel in Louisville. Victoria had always dreamed of having her engagement party at an elegant hotel, and her father, Richard Sterling, insisted on paying for everything. It was going to be a big, fancy, sophisticated party. And then Connor said something that cut me deep. He told me I'd need to buy a nice dress, something appropriate for the occasion, because it was going to be a formal event. Something appropriate. As if he thought I didn't know what was appropriate. As if he thought I'd show up in my farm clothes and embarrass him in front of the important Sterlings. I almost laughed right then and there. Almost told him everything in that exact moment. Almost revealed that I owned the hotel. That every decision about the decor, the menu, the service, everything he thought the Sterlings were so generously paying for, all of it was mine. But something held me back. A growing intuition. A feeling that things weren't what they seemed. That there was something very wrong with the Sterlings. Something I hadn't been able to pinpoint yet, but was there, hiding in plain sight. So I just said yes. I'd buy a nice, appropriate dress. And I did. I drove to the Nordstrom in Louisville on a Tuesday afternoon and picked out a simple charcoal gray dress, elegant but understated, that cost $175. Nothing extravagant, nothing that would draw too much attention. Just appropriate for a groom's mother who was supposedly living off a pension on a farm in rural Kentucky. And that's how I ended up at that party. In my $175 dress, my silver hair undyed, my worn-out purse. And that's how I heard Victoria Sterling call me the farm woman who smells like manure. She might think I was a nobody, some country bumpkin, but she was about to find out that the nobody owned the very ground she was standing on. The first hour of that party felt like I was underwater. Everything seemed muffled, distant, a little unreal. I walked around the ballroom with a glass of sparkling water in my hand, greeting people I didn't know, smiling politely when someone asked how I was. Connor introduced me to a few of his friends, always with that slightly apologetic tone in his voice, like he was sorry I was there. And every time he did that, every time I saw that subtle embarrassment in my son's eyes, my heart broke a little more. Victoria was on the other side of the room, surrounded by her friends, laughing loud, showing off her engagement ring to anyone who came near. The ring Connor bought with 4 months' salary. A 1.5-carat diamond that probably cost around $15,000. She'd hold her hand up to the light, making the diamond sparkle, and her friends would make those little oohs and ahs that women make when they see expensive jewelry. I watched her from a distance, studying her every move. Victoria was beautiful. There was no denying it. Long, straight blonde hair, perfect skin, a slender body that was clearly the result of hours at the gym and a strict diet. A tight white dress that probably cost more than my car. Sky-high heels that I recognized as Jimmy Choo's because the soles had that specific finish. At least $1,450? Easy. For a family that supposedly had real money, they sure made a show of it. And that bothered me something fierce. People with real money, old money, they don't have to prove anything to anyone. They just are. But the Sterlings, they were performing wealth. Showing it off. And the more I watched, the more it smelled like a facade, a pretty lie. It was around 7:30 that I met Victoria's parents in person. Connor brought me over to them, his hand light on my back, guiding me through the crowd. Richard and Catherine Sterling were near the bar, talking with a group of people who looked important by the way they dressed and carried themselves. Richard was a tall man, maybe 6'3", with perfectly cut gray hair and a suit that just screamed money. He greeted me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a handshake that was a little too firm, the kind men use when they want to show dominance. He told me he'd heard so much about me that it was a pleasure to finally meet Connor's mother. But the way he spoke, looking slightly over my head instead of into my eyes, as if he was already searching for someone more interesting to talk to, that told me everything I needed to know. Catherine was an older version of Victoria. Blonde, too thin, her face stretched from plastic surgeries trying to hide the 60-some years she clearly had. A light pink cocktail dress, too much jewelry. She greeted me with that kind of fake hug that rich women give to women they think are beneath them, just touching shoulders without really making contact. She told me she just loved the rustic charm of my style, and the way she said rustic charm sounded exactly like poor and classless. We tried to have a conversation. Richard asked me about the farm, and when I said I still lived there, that I raised cattle, he made a comment about how gratifying it must be to live a simple life, without the complications of the corporate world. Catherine agreed, saying she admired people who knew how to live with little, who didn't need luxuries to be happy. Every word was a stab disguised as a compliment. I smiled and said yes, I was very happy with my simple life, and on the inside, I was calculating how much Catherine's outfit was worth, calculating how much they'd spent on this party they thought they were paying for, but was actually mine, calculating how long I was going to wait before I revealed who I really was. The conversation didn't last long. Richard was soon pulled away by another guest. Catherine followed him, and I was left standing there next to Connor, who immediately started telling me how wonderful the Sterlings were, how generous they'd been to pay for this whole party, how I should feel lucky that Victoria came from such a good family. Lucky. My son thought I should feel lucky. I was about to answer, about to say something, when my phone vibrated in my dress pocket. I pulled it out discreetly and looked at the screen. A text from James. "I need to speak with you. Urgent. Come to my office." I told Connor I needed to use the ladies' room and walked away quickly, crossing the ballroom toward the side door that led to the service corridors. I went up the stairs almost at a run, my heart pounding, knowing that James wouldn't call me with that kind of urgency unless it was truly important. I walked into his office without knocking. James was standing behind his desk, a tablet in his hand. His face looked drawn and tight, the color gone from it. He looked up at me and said just one thing. "Mrs. Hayes, you need to see this. Right now." I walked over to the desk. James turned the tablet toward me, and what I saw made my blood run absolutely cold. It was a police file, a mugshot, front and profile. And the woman in the photo was Victoria. Or rather, it was Amanda Rose Mitchell. That was her real name. Amanda Rose Mitchell, born in Las Vegas, Nevada, 26 years old. Arrested twice for fraud, once for forgery. An active arrest warrant in Nevada for grand larceny. I kept scrolling. There was more. So much more. Richard Sterling was actually Richard Mitchell. Catherine was Catherine Mitchell. The entire family was a sham. The Mitchells were known in 4 states for running scams, marrying their daughters off to men from stable families, draining their accounts, and disappearing before anyone could press charges. There were newspaper articles. One from Reno, Nevada, from 3 years ago. Family of grifters steals over $950,000 from investors. Another from Salt Lake City, Utah. Woman marries wealthy widower. Vanishes with life savings. And another from Boise, Idaho. Police seek family of con artists known for marriage fraud. All of them about the Mitchells. All of them about the family my son was about to marry into. My head was spinning like a top. I held on to the edge of James's desk, trying to process what I was seeing. My son was engaged to a criminal, to a woman with an active warrant for her arrest, to someone who was planning to rob him blind and destroy his life. And suddenly, it all made sense. Her over-the-top interest in Connor's portfolio, the questions about liquidity, about how much cash he had available, the rush to set a wedding date, Richard casually asking about Connor's assets, about inheritances, about bank accounts. They weren't marrying my son, they were marrying the $385,000 they thought he had. $385,000 that was actually mine. I looked at James, who was watching me with concern written all over his face. I asked if he was absolutely sure, if it couldn't be a mistake, people with similar names. James shook his head and showed me more documents. There was facial recognition confirming that Victoria Sterling and Amanda Mitchell were the same person. There was a fingerprint match from a prior arrest that was a perfect hit. There was even video footage of an interview she'd given to the Nevada police 4 years ago. There was no doubt. None at all. It was her. I sank into the chair across from James's desk, my head in my hands. For a moment, just one moment, I let the weight of it all just crush me. My son was about to marry a felon. He was being deceived, manipulated, played for a fool. And he had no earthly idea. But then, slowly, the sadness started to curdle into something else. Anger. Cold, calculated anger. This family had come to my city, to my hotel, had insulted me in my life, and was planning to destroy my son. Did they really think I was just going to let that happen? I lifted my head and looked at James. I asked if he'd contacted the FBI. James said yes. The minute he'd confirmed their identities, he'd called the regional office. The agents were on their way. They'd be here in less than an hour. 1 hour. I had 1 hour to decide how to handle this. I could go down there right now, pull Connor aside, tell him everything, show him the evidence, call the local police, end this thing before it went any further. That would be the sensible thing to do, the safe thing for everyone. But then I thought about Victoria downstairs. I thought about her laughing with her friends, showing off that ring, calling me the farm woman who smells like manure. I thought about Richard and Catherine, looking at me with that barely hidden disdain, thinking I was a nobody, some country fool they could ignore while they robbed my son blind. They had underestimated me. Completely. And I was going to make them pay for it. I looked at James and said, I want you to prepare a presentation. Photos, articles, everything you have on the Mitchells. I want it on every screen in that ballroom. James just stared at me, surprised, trying to figure out where I was going with this. I explained my plan. During the toast, which was scheduled for 9 o'clock, when Richard Sterling got up on that stage to give his speech about the couple's wonderful future, I was going to expose them, in front of everyone, publicly, with no chance to run, no chance to make up pretty lies or excuses. James was quiet for a moment, processing it. Then he asked if I was sure, if it wouldn't be better to do it more privately, to protect Connor from the public humiliation. I understood his concern. It was valid. My son was going to be humiliated, betrayed, devastated when he found out the truth in front of all those people. But he needed to see it. He needed to see it in front of all those friends he'd bragged to about Victoria, in front of his colleagues from work, in front of everyone. Because if I told him in private, he might not believe me. He might think I was making it up, that I was jealous, that I didn't want him to be happy with this woman. But if everyone saw it at the same time, if the evidence was irrefutable in public, there would be no room for denial. I told James to get everything ready. He nodded and got to work right away, connecting the tablet to the hotel's projection system, compiling the information into a clear, devastating presentation. While he worked, I stood there by the window, looking down at the street below. People were passing by, normal people, living their normal lives, with no idea of the drama unfolding inside. And I thought about Robert. I thought about how he would have handled this. Robert was a calm, patient man. He would have told me to go slow, to think it through, not to act out of anger. But Robert wasn't here. And I'd spent 7 years learning to trust my own instincts, to make tough decisions, to protect what was mine. My son was mine. And nobody was going to hurt him, not while I had breath in my body. James finished the presentation and showed it to me. It was perfect. It started with the mugshots, then showed the newspaper articles about their previous crimes, then a timeline of their victims over the last 6 years. 8 different men in 5 states, all of them drained financially. All of them left broke and humiliated. Connor was going to be number 9, but not if I could help it. I looked at the clock. 8:15. I had 45 minutes until the toast. Enough time. I told James I was going back to the party, that he should stay on standby with the presentation. The moment I sent him a text, he was to start the broadcast on all the screens. James agreed, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Respect. Maybe even a little admiration. Before I left, I turned back to him and said, "James, when this is all over, when the FBI agents get here and take them away, I want you to make an announcement." He asked what kind of announcement. I smiled. A small, cold smile. I said, "I want you to introduce the owner of the hotel. Officially." Understanding dawned on James's face. He almost smiled too. He said it would be an honor. I went back down to the party. The ballroom was even more crowded now. More people had arrived. The music was louder, the conversations more lively. The champagne was flowing freely. The buffet was being constantly refilled. Everything was perfect. Exactly as I'd planned when I approved every detail of this party weeks ago without anyone knowing. I found Connor near the dance floor, talking with some friends. He saw me coming and smiled, that little boy smile that reminded me of when he was 5 and would come running to show me a drawing he'd made. My heart ached. In just a few hours, that smile would be gone. He was going to find out the woman he loved was a lie. And as much as I knew I was doing the right thing, as much as I knew I was protecting him, the pain I was about to cause was real. But it was necessary, like pulling out an infected splinter. It hurts, but it's the only way to heal. Connor asked if I was having a good time, if I was enjoying the party. I said yes, that everything was beautiful. He was happy with that answer and told me that Victoria had loved every detail, that the Sterlings were impressed with the quality of the hotel, that everything was just perfect. Perfect. That word again. Victoria came up to us just then, her arm linked through Connor's, a smile plastered on her face. She barely looked at me, just said something about it being time to take family pictures, that the photographer was waiting. Connor agreed, and they started to walk away, but Victoria stopped, turned her head slightly in my direction, and said in that sickly sweet fake voice, "Margaret, you don't need to be in the family photos if you don't want to. I know you must be tired. There's a rest area in the corner if you want to sit down for a bit." She was dismissing me, at my own son's party, in my own hotel. Connor, not even realizing the insult, just nodded in agreement, said that I did look tired, that I didn't have to be in the pictures if I didn't want to. And then they walked off, leaving me standing there all alone. I watched them cross the ballroom toward the photographer. I watched Victoria pose, turning her body at that angle. Beautiful women learn early on makes them look even better in photos. I watched Richard and Catherine join them, all of them smiling, all of them pretending to be a perfect family. And I thought, enjoy it. Enjoy these last few minutes of your charade, because in half an hour it's all coming crashing down. I took a glass of champagne from a passing tray, not because I wanted to drink, but because I needed something in my hands to look normal. I circulated through the room, listening to snippets of conversations. People talking about how beautiful Victoria was, how lucky Connor was, what an impressive family the Sterlings were. An older woman, someone who seemed to be a friend of Connor's father, commented quietly to her friend that it was a good thing Connor had found someone from a good family, because bless his heart, he came from such humble beginnings. Humble beginnings. As if that was a bad thing. As if me and Robert hadn't given Connor everything he needed, everything that truly mattered in life. 8:40, 20 minutes until the toast. I saw Richard Sterling near the bar, talking on his cell phone. He'd moved to a quieter corner, his hand partially covering his mouth, clearly trying to have some privacy. Something about the way he was talking, his tense body language, made me pay attention. I moved closer slowly, pretending to be interested in the flower arrangements near where he was standing, close enough to overhear without being noticed. And what I heard confirmed everything. Richard was speaking low, but his tone was urgent. I managed to catch parts of the conversation. Yes, his portfolio is real. 385,000. I confirmed it myself. Saw the statements with my own eyes. As soon as they're married, she'll have access to the joint account he promised to open. 2 months max, we drain it all and disappear. Yes, it should be enough to cover what we owe in Oregon and give us a fresh start somewhere else. My God, they were in debt, probably to dangerous people, and they were planning to use Connor's money, my money, to pay off their debts. Richard kept talking. His mother is no problem. She's a simpleton who lives on a farm. Barely knows how to use the internet. She won't even notice until it's too late. A simpleton. He called me a simpleton. I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. Not from humor, but from pure disbelief. This man, this criminal, was standing in my hotel, drinking my champagne, planning to steal money I had grown, and calling me a simpleton. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Richard hung up the phone and went back to the party, rejoining Catherine, the fake smile back on his face. I just stood there, processing what I'd heard. 2 months. They were planning to keep up the charade for just 2 months after the wedding before they stole everything and vanished. It wasn't even going to get that far. Not even close. I took out my phone and sent a text to James. Confirm FBI agents are en route. Need exact ETA. The reply came back fast. Confirmed. Arriving at 21:30, 20 minutes after scheduled toast. Perfect. Perfect timing. I'd expose them at 9, and half an hour later, while they were still trying to process what had happened, trying to make excuses or maybe even trying to run, the FBI would arrive and lead them away in handcuffs. There would be no escape. I looked at the clock again. 8:55. 5 minutes until the toast. I searched the room for Connor with my eyes. He was with Victoria, the two of them talking with a group of his friends from college. He looked so happy, so completely oblivious to the nightmare that was about to unfold. My heart hurt. It hurt in a physical way, like someone was squeezing it in their fist, because I knew that in the next few minutes I was going to destroy that happiness. I was going to show my son that the woman he loved was a liar, a criminal, someone who had never truly loved him at all. But there was no other choice. I had to do it. For him. To protect him. 9 o'clock. The lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly, and the music stopped. One of the party planners, someone from the event team the Sterlings had hired, announced that it was time for the official toast. Richard Sterling was invited to come up to the small stage that had been set up at one end of the room. Richard walked up the stage steps with that fake confidence of someone who's used to fooling people. He took the microphone, adjusted his expensive suit, and smiled at the crowd. Everyone turned toward him, champagne glasses in hand, waiting for the pretty words. He started to speak. Pretty words about family, about love, about how happy he was to welcome Connor into the Sterling family, about how Victoria had found the perfect man, about how their future was bright, prosperous, full of wonderful possibilities. Prosperous. He actually had the gall to use that word. He kept talking, something about family values, about building a future together, about how true love conquers all. And the more he talked, the more my anger grew, because every word was a lie, every smile was fake, every promise was empty. I discreetly took out my phone, still keeping an eye on Richard on the stage. I typed a single word and sent it to James. Now. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Richard kept talking, the crowd kept listening, and then the screens changed. There were 3 large screens in the ballroom, set up to show a slideshow of photos of Connor and Victoria from their relationship. They'd been playing beautiful pictures all night, happy moments, smiles, hugs, the kind of thing that makes people sigh. But now, all 3 screens showed the exact same thing. A mugshot. Amanda Rose Mitchell. Front and profile. Height, weight, identifying features. Charges, fraud, grand larceny, forgery. The silence was instant. Absolute. Richard stopped talking mid-sentence, his mouth still open, staring at the screens with a look of dawning horror. Victoria let out a little choked gasp. Catherine looked like she'd seen a ghost. The screen changed again. Now it showed newspaper headlines. Family of grifters steals $950,000. Woman wanted for marriage fraud. Police warn of scheme to marry heirs. And then photos. Photos of Amanda Mitchell with other men. 8 different men, all wedding or engagement photos, all with the same fake smile she'd used on Connor. The crowd was in total shock. People started whispering, pointing at the screens, looking from Victoria to the images and back again. Someone swore under their breath. Someone else dropped their champagne flute, and it shattered on the marble floor with a sound that echoed through the silence. The blood drained right out of Victoria's face. She looked around desperately, searching for an exit, an explanation, anything. Richard dropped the microphone on the stage with a thud that echoed through the sound system and started coming down the steps fast. But I wasn't done yet. James's voice came over the sound system, clear and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We would like to ask for your attention for an important announcement. Please welcome the owner of the Montgomery Grand Hotel, Mrs. Margaret Hayes." Every head in that room turned to me. 100 pairs of eyes, all fixed on the farm woman they'd ignored all night. I started walking toward the stage, slow, with steady, measured steps. The silence was so deep, I could hear the sound of my own shoes on the marble, that click, clack, click that echoed through the enormous hall. Connor was frozen, completely paralyzed. He was looking at the screens, then at Victoria, then at me, trying to process what was happening, trying to understand how all these pieces fit together. I saw the exact moment his confusion started to turn into comprehension, and then into pure horror. Victoria was shaken. Her hands were trembling so badly she dropped her own champagne flute, and it shattered at her feet into 1,000 crystal pieces. She looked at me with a hatred so pure, so visceral, that if looks could kill, I would have dropped dead right there. But she didn't say a word. What could she say? The evidence was right there, on giant screens, irrefutable. I walked up the stage steps. I picked up the microphone Richard had dropped. I adjusted the height because he was taller than me. And then, looking out at that crowd of 100 shocked people, I began to speak. I said there seemed to be a misunderstanding about a few things, that maybe it was time to clear up some facts. I started by explaining that I had been the owner of the Montgomery Grand Hotel for 4 years, that I'd bought the place when it was in ruins and turned it into the elegant establishment they were seeing tonight. I saw people's eyes go wide. I saw Connor put a hand to his mouth, shock painted on every line of his face. I went on. I said that the Sterlings had shown a particular interest in my son's investment fund, that $385,000 that Connor was so proud of building on his own. And then, looking directly at Victoria, I told the truth my son had never heard. That fund was created by me. It was managed by me. Every single cent of its growth was the result of my investment decisions. And as of tonight, that fund will be liquidated. The sound Connor made was somewhere between a groan and a choked cry. He stumbled backward, and one of his friends had to grab his arm to keep him from falling. But I couldn't stop. Not now. I kept talking, explaining that I'd discovered the true identity of the Sterlings, or rather, the Mitchells, that they were wanted in multiple states for marriage fraud. That my son wasn't the first man they'd tried to rob, just the latest in a long line of victims. That's when Victoria exploded. She screamed that I was lying, that it was all doctored photos, that I was making it all up because I was jealous of her, because I didn't want Connor to be happy. Her voice was shrill, desperate, cracking at the edges. A few people started to murmur again, confused, not knowing who to believe, and that's when I played my final card. I said that FBI agents were on their way at that very moment, that they'd be arriving in about 25 minutes to execute arrest warrants for Amanda Rose Mitchell and Richard Mitchell, that they were free to stay and wait for the authorities to arrive, or they could try to run, but I was sure the FBI would love a good chase. Richard tried to run. He really did. He stumbled off the stage, pushing people out of his way, heading for the main exit. But James had been smarter. The doors were locked from the inside, and the hotel's security team was positioned at every exit. Richard banged on the glass doors, yelling for them to open up, but nobody moved. Catherine started to cry. Not the pretty, delicate cry of a rich woman. This was an ugly, desperate sob from someone who knows it's all over. She collapsed into a chair, her face in her hands, her shoulders shaken violently. And Victoria, Amanda, whoever she was, she looked at me with a hatred I had never seen before in my entire life. She walked toward the stage, coming up the steps even as several people tried to stop her, and stood right in front of me. For a second, I thought she was going to hit me. Her fists were clenched, her whole body trembling with rage. But she just said, in a low voice full of venom, "You ruined everything. You were supposed to be nobody. An ignorant fool we could manipulate. How dare you?" How dare I? She really asked me, how dare I? I looked right into her eyes, those blue eyes I'd thought were pretty when I'd met her a year and a half ago, and I said just one thing. I dare, because this is my hotel, this is my money, and this is my son. And you never had a right to any of the three. That's when we heard the sirens. The FBI had arrived earlier than expected. James must have called them when he saw Richard trying to run. The ballroom doors opened, and 4 agents walked in, badges out, guns in their holsters. The lead agent, a tall man in his 40s, walked up to Amanda and told her she was under arrest for fraud, grand larceny, and violation of parole in Nevada. He read her rights as he put her in handcuffs. Amanda didn't resist. She just stood there, staring at the floor, defeated. Richard and Catherine were arrested next. Catherine kept crying, begging the agents, saying it was all Richard's idea, that she hadn't done anything. Richard just stood there in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on some distant point. As the agents led the 3 of them out, past the silent, shocked crowd, Victoria turned her head toward me one last time. And you know what she said? She said I had just made the biggest mistake of my life, that I would regret it, that my son would never forgive me for ruining his happiness. And in that moment, looking over at my Connor across the room, seeing the color drained from his face, shaken, his eyes filled with tears he was desperately trying not to let fall. I wondered if she was right, if I'd done the right thing, or if I had just destroyed my relationship with my son forever. The agents left, taking the Mitchells with them. The doors closed behind them, and the silence they left behind was so heavy I could barely breathe. People started to leave, slowly, in small groups, whispering to each other, looking back as they walked to the exit. Nobody knew what to do, what to say. What was supposed to be a celebration had turned into a nightmare. In 15 minutes, the ballroom was almost empty. All that was left was Connor, a few of his closest friends, James and me. I came down from the stage slowly. My legs were trembling, the adrenaline starting to fade, leaving behind a deep exhaustion that went all the way to my bones. I walked over to Connor, who was sitting in a chair, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. I got close to him and said his name softly. He didn't look at me. He just shook his head, as if to say, "Not now. Don't talk to me now." One of his friends, a young man named Dylan, who I'd known for years, came over to me and said gently that maybe it was best if I gave Connor some time to process everything, that it had been a lot all at once, that he was going to need some space. I understood. Of course I understood. My son had just found out that the woman he loved was a criminal, that the money he thought he'd built was actually mine, that his entire life for the past few years had been based on lies. He needed time. But before I left him there with his friends, I needed him to know one thing. I knelt down in front of him, forcing him to look me in the eye. And I said, "Connor, everything I did to protect you. That woman was going to destroy you. She was going to steal everything and disappear, leaving you with nothing. I couldn't let that happen. You're my son. I will always protect you." Connor looked at me with those green eyes he got from his father, and I saw so much pain in them. My heart just broke. He said, his voice choked, "You lied to me. For years. You let me believe I was good at something when it was all you. How can I trust you now?" And then he stood up and walked away. Just turned his back and left, his friends following behind him, leaving me there alone in the middle of that empty ballroom full of spilled champagne and broken crystal. I stood there for a long time. I don't know how long. Could have been 5 minutes, could have been an hour. Just looking at the wreckage of a party that had started with so much promise and ended in total chaos. James eventually came over, put a gentle hand on my shoulder, and asked if I was all right. I said I was, but we both knew it was a lie. He helped me to a chair, brought me a glass of water, and just sat there with me in silence. After a while, I asked him if I'd made the right decision, if I shouldn't have done it differently, more privately, less publicly. James was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said there was no right answer to that question, that I had protected my son from dangerous people, and that was undeniable. But the cost had been high, very high. I knew he was right. I looked around the ballroom, at the screens still displaying the evidence against the Mitchells, at the tables full of food nobody had touched, at the flower arrangements that had cost $60 apiece and would now wilt without anyone to enjoy them. And I thought about how I'd gotten here. I thought about that scared widow from 7 years ago, sitting on Robert's office floor, discovering she had enough money to change her life. I thought about all the decisions I'd made since then. To invest instead of spend. To study instead of give up. To buy the hotel instead of living quietly on the farm. To create the fund for Connor instead of just giving him the money. Every decision had seemed right at the time. But now, sitting there in that empty ballroom, I wondered if I'd lost something important along the way. If I'd become so focused on protecting and providing that I'd forgotten to just trust. To trust my son. To trust that he could handle the truth. Because the truth was, Connor was right. I had lied to him. For years. I'd let him believe in something that wasn't real. And yes, my intentions were good. Yes, I wanted to give him confidence, pride, something to stand on. But in the end, all I'd given him was an illusion. And when that illusion shattered, it shattered so spectacularly, so publicly, so humiliatingly, that I didn't know if my son would ever be able to forgive me. James eventually had to go take care of the details of shutting down the event. The cleaning crew needed to come in. The food had to be collected. The guests who were still wandering the hotel had to be gently encouraged to go home. I stayed a little longer, just sitting there in that chair, looking at the empty space. And then, because there was nothing else I could do there, I got up and left. I drove the 2 hours back to the farm in total silence. No music, no radio, just the sound of the engine and the tires on the road. When I got home, it was almost midnight. The moon was full, lighting up the silver fields, the cattle sleeping in the pasture, everything peaceful and quiet. I went into the empty house. Without turning on the lights, I just walked to the bedroom, took off that charcoal gray dress I'd chosen so carefully, put on my old comfortable nightgown, and got into bed. And it was only then, alone in the dark, that I finally let the tears come. I cried for Robert, who would have known how to handle all of this better than I did. I cried for Connor, for his broken heart, for the betrayal he'd suffered. I cried for myself, for the loneliness that had been my constant companion for the last 7 years. But most of all, I cried because I knew I had done the right thing, and yet it felt so wrong. The days after that night were the hardest of my entire life. Harder even than the months after Robert's death, because at least then I knew I was mourning something that had been real, a true love. Now I was mourning the relationship with my son, and I didn't know if I could ever fix it. Connor wouldn't answer my calls. I sent texts, I left voicemails, I tried every way I could to get in touch. Nothing. Complete silence. I talked to Dylan, his friend who'd been at the party, and he told me Connor was devastated, that he'd taken 2 weeks off work, that he was just staying in his apartment and didn't want to see anyone. I asked if he was okay, if he was eating, if he needed anything. Dylan hesitated before he answered, and then he said something that cut me deep. He said Connor felt like his whole life was a lie, that he didn't know who to trust anymore, that he felt like a fool for not realizing Victoria was a fake, for not realizing his money was mine. I wanted to go there. I wanted to drive to Cincinnati, knock on his apartment door, and force him to listen to me. But James advised against it. He said Connor needed time, that forcing the issue would only make things worse. And deep down, I knew he was right. So I waited. I went back to the farm routine as if nothing had happened. I woke up at 5:30, took care of the cattle, fed the chickens, fixed fences. But everything felt colorless, without purpose. I was just going through the motions, an actress playing the part of a farmer, but not feeling anything real. The news about the Mitchells' arrest spread like wildfire. It was in all the regional papers. The FBI had discovered they had more victims than I'd even imagined. It wasn't 8 men, it was 15, in 7 different states. In total, they'd stolen nearly $1,650,000 over 9 years. I got a call from an FBI agent, a man named David Martinez, who wanted my official statement. I went to their office in Louisville on a Thursday morning and spent 3 hours telling them everything I knew, everything I'd discovered, how I'd planned the public reveal. Agent Martinez listened carefully, taken detailed notes. At the end, he said something that surprised me. He said what I'd done was brave, that most people would have just confronted the fiancée in private and let her get away. That because of my actions, the FBI had been able to arrest a family of criminals who had dodged the law for nearly a decade. I asked about the other victims, the men who'd been robbed before Connor. Agent Martinez explained that some had managed to get a little money back through court orders, but most had lost everything. The Mitchells spent money fast, living a luxurious lifestyle they couldn't afford. When the money ran out, they just moved on to the next victim. I left that office feeling a little better. At least I'd done something right. I'd stopped criminals. I'd protected my son from a fate that could have been so much worse. But the good feeling didn't last, because when I got home, there was a message on the landline. It was Connor. His voice was tense, controlled. "Mom, I need access to the investment fund. You said you were going to liquidate it. I need to know where the money is, how much there is, everything. Call me back." Not a hello. Not a how are you. Just demands. But at least he'd called. It was a start. I called him back right away. Connor answered on the first ring. I tried to ask how he was, but he cut me off. Said he didn't want to talk, he just wanted information about the money. So I explained. I told him the fund had $385,000, that I'd opened the account in his name 5 years ago, that all the investments had been made by me, but that legally, the money was his. There was a long pause on the other end. Then Connor asked, "So you're saying I can access this money? That it's really mine?" I said yes, that it had always been his, that I was just managing it because he didn't know how, that I never intended to keep the money, just to make it grow for when he needed it. Another pause, longer this time. And then Connor said something that shocked me. "I want to liquidate everything. Transfer all the money to an account you don't have access to. I don't want anything else that you control." My heart just sank, but I understood. Of course I did. My son was trying to get some control back over his own life, trying to have something that was truly his, without my influence. I said yes, that I'd arrange for everything, that I'd contact the brokerage manager, coordinate the transfer, that he'd get all the documents in a few days. Connor gave a short thanks and hung up. Not even a goodbye, just the click of the line going dead. I sat there in the kitchen for a long time after that call, staring at the landline phone that Robert and I had bought 20 years ago, and I realized I was losing my son, not to Victoria, not to the Mitchells, but to my own actions, to my own well-intentioned lies. I processed the money transfer the next morning. I called Stephen Davidson, my investment manager, and explained the situation. Stephen was surprised, asked if I was sure, if I didn't want to keep some control, or at least a joint account. But I said no, that Connor wanted total independence, and I was going to give it to him. Stephen prepared all the documents. In 5 days, the $385,000 was transferred to a new account in Connor's name, with no access from me. I got the confirmation by email and immediately forwarded it to Connor. He replied with just 2 words, "Received, thanks." Not even a real thank you, just that cold formality you use with strangers. The weeks dragged by. November brought that autumn chill I usually loved, but that year it just made me feel even more alone. The leaves on the trees around the farm started to turn, red and gold, fall into the ground in beautiful carpets that I used to admire on my morning walks. But nothing felt beautiful that year. Everything just seemed gray, dull, empty. James called me regularly from the hotel, updating me on operations, asking about decisions that needed to be made. The Montgomery was doing well, despite the scandal. In fact, it was doing better than ever. Apparently, publicity, even bad publicity, was still publicity. People wanted to stay at the hotel where that dramatic FBI arrest had happened. We even got requests for interviews from local papers, wanting to know the story behind the story. I turned them all down. The last thing I wanted was more attention, more exposure. It took almost 2 months. 2 long, painful months. But then, on a cold December morning, almost 3 months after that disastrous party, I got a text from Connor. A simple text. "Can we talk? In person?" My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone. I replied right away, saying yes, he could come to the farm whenever he wanted, or I could drive to Cincinnati, whatever was best for him. He said he'd come to the farm on Saturday, that he had some things he needed to tell me, some questions he needed to ask. Saturday couldn't come fast enough. I spent the days cleaning the whole house, cooking Connor's favorite foods, preparing myself for anything he might say. Prepared for anger, for accusations, for hurt. Prepared even for him to say he didn't want to have contact with me anymore. Because at least he was coming. At least he was willing to talk. On Saturday morning, I woke up before the sun. I showered, got dressed carefully, made coffee. And then I waited. Connor arrived at noon. He got out of his car slowly, his hands in his winter coat pockets, his eyes avoiding mine. He looked thinner than I remembered, older too. He had deep circles under his eyes, like he hadn't been sleeping well. I invited him in. I served him coffee, cut him a slice of the lemon cake I'd made, the one he'd always loved since he was a little boy. We sat at the kitchen table, that same table where we'd had thousands of breakfasts together over the years. The silence was long and uncomfortable. Neither of us knew how to start. Finally, Connor spoke. He said he'd spent the last few months thinking, processing everything that had happened, that he'd been angry, hurt, and ashamed, that he'd felt like an idiot, like a child who'd been tricked by his own mother. I let him talk without interrupting, because he needed to say it. He needed to get it all out. He went on. He said he'd been talking to a therapist, someone Dylan had recommended, and that it had helped, that he was starting to understand why I did what I did, even if it still hurt. And then he looked me in the eye for the first time since he'd arrived and said, "Mom, I brought something that belongs to you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, dark blue velvet box. My heart leaped. I knew that box. Connor opened it and showed me. Inside was my grandmother's pearl necklace, the one that had been passed down for generations, that Robert had given me on our 12th wedding anniversary, that I kept in the small safe in my bedroom. I looked at Connor, confused, not understanding. He explained. He said he'd given the necklace to Victoria about 7 months ago. She'd mentioned how she thought vintage jewelry was so elegant, and he'd wanted to impress her by giving her something with family history. He'd come to the farm one day when I wasn't home, opened the safe using the combination he'd known since he was a teenager, and had taken the necklace. I hadn't known. I hadn't even noticed it was missing because I so rarely opened that safe. Connor kept explaining. He said that when Victoria was arrested, all her possessions were confiscated as evidence. The FBI had found the necklace among her things, and knowing it had been taken from me, had returned it to him. He said he'd held on to it for weeks, wanting to give it back, but not having the courage to get in touch. He held the box out to me, his hand shaken just a little. "I gave this to her thinking you didn't care about these things. I thought you didn't care about family heirlooms, about sentimentality. I judged you so wrong, Mom. I underestimated you so completely." I took the box from his hands. The necklace was there, just as I remembered. Delicate, old pearls set in gold. It weighed almost nothing physically, but in my palm, it felt like it weighed a ton. And that's when I broke down. All those weeks of holding everything in, of trying to be strong, of pretending I was okay, it all came rushing out at once. I started to cry, that ugly, uncontrollable cry that comes from the very bottom of your soul. Connor stood up quickly and came to my side, putting his arms around me for the first time in months. And we both just cried right there, in the kitchen, holding on to each other like we were drowning, and the other was the only thing keeping us afloat. After we composed ourselves from that emotional explosion in the kitchen, Connor and I talked for hours. Really talked, for the first time in maybe years. He asked me questions about the investments, about how I'd learned, about when I'd started. I told him everything. About finding that shoebox with Robert's papers, about discovering the tech stocks, about the decision to learn how to invest. Connor listened with an attention I hadn't seen in him since he was a child. He asked smart questions about strategies, about how I identified good opportunities, about how I managed risk. And I realized that my son was truly smart. He had genuine potential to understand the market. He just never had the chance to really learn. When I got to the part about the hotel, about how I'd bought the Montgomery and turned it around, Connor was silent for a long time. Then he said something that surprised me. He said he was proud of me, that he'd always thought I was just a simple homemaker. But now he saw that I was so much more than that I had built something truly impressive. His words warmed me in a way I hadn't expected, because that's what I'd wanted, deep down. Not necessarily recognition, but just to be seen. To be seen for who I really was, not the simple version everyone assumed. Before Connor left that afternoon, as it was getting dark outside, he hesitated at the door. He turned to me and said he wanted to learn. He wanted me to teach him how to really invest, not just give him the money, but show him how to do it, how to analyze, how to decide. He said he wanted to build something real this time, something that was genuinely his. My heart nearly burst with happiness. I said yes, that I would love to teach him, that we could start whenever he wanted. We agreed to have weekly sessions by video call, every Thursday night at 8 o'clock. I'd prepare materials, explain concepts, and he'd do homework, like a private class, but from a mother to her son. In the weeks that followed, those sessions became the best part of my week. Connor was a dedicated student. He did all the reading I recommended, came with prepared questions, and really worked to understand not just what to do, but why. We started with the basics: stocks versus bonds, diversification, fundamental versus technical analysis. Then we got more advanced: growth sectors, undervalued companies, how to read financial statements. And something beautiful started to happen. Every week, I saw my son's confidence grow. But this time, it was a real confidence based on true knowledge, not on illusions I had created. Connor also started doing his own research. He'd show me companies he was studying, present analyses he'd done, and ask for my opinion. And often, his analyses were good, really good. He had a natural talent that I had never given him a chance to develop. It was during one of those sessions, toward the end of February, that Connor mentioned something important. He said he'd used $25,000 from the fund to pay off all the debt he'd accumulated. Credit cards, his car loan, everything. He was finally debt-free and ready to start investing the rest intelligently. I was so proud. That was exactly the right decision. Paying off high-interest debt before investing was investing 101. I asked about his job, how things were in Cincinnati. Connor hesitated before answering. Then he admitted it had been tough, that everyone in the office knew about the scandal with Victoria, that it had been humiliating to explain to his colleagues that his fiancée was a criminal. But he said he'd also learned something important. He'd found out who his real friends were. Dylan had been incredible, standing by him through it all. Some people at work had also been supportive, understanding. And then Connor told me something that made my blood run cold. He said that Victoria, or rather Amanda, had tried to contact him from prison. She'd sent a letter asking him to visit her, saying they needed to talk, that she could explain everything. I asked if he'd gone. Connor shook his head on the computer screen. He said no, that he hadn't even answered the letter, that there was nothing she could say that would change what she'd done. I felt an enormous sense of relief, because part of me had been afraid that Connor still had feelings for her, that he could be manipulated again. But he was stronger than I thought. He was truly moving on. It was in March that I got the call from the lawyer, Samuel Cooper, again. He informed me that the Mitchells' trial was set for April and that he would need my testimony. He asked if I was still willing, and I said yes without hesitation. I also asked about the other cases, about the other victims. Samuel told me the FBI had managed to identify 2 more men who hadn't come forward before. In total, there were now 17 victims in 8 states. The total amount stolen was close to $2 million. $2 million. From destroyed lives, stolen savings, and broken hearts. Samuel explained that the Mitchells were facing multiple federal charges: wire fraud, conspiracy, tax evasion, forgery. If convicted on all charges, they could each face up to 28 years in prison. 28 years. Amanda, or Victoria, or whoever she really was, would spend most of her remaining adult life behind bars. Part of me felt satisfied by that, justice being served. But another part, a small, honest part, felt sad. Sad for the waste. That woman was young, beautiful, clearly intelligent. She could have done something real with her life, but she chose the path of fraud, lies, and manipulation. And now she was going to pay the price. April came, bringing that promise of spring, that warmer air that starts to melt the last bit of cold. On the day of the trial, Connor insisted on going with me. He said he wanted to be there, that he needed to see the Mitchells face the consequences. We drove together to the federal courthouse in Indianapolis on a Tuesday morning. The building was imposing, all gray stone with huge columns out front. We walked up the steps and went through security, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought it was going to beat right out of my chest. The courtroom was packed. There were the other victims, men of various ages, all with similar expressions of pain and contained anger. There were reporters scribbling in notepads, taking photos when allowed. There was family on both sides, some supporting the victims, others still loyal to the Mitchells. And then they walked in. Amanda, Richard, and Catherine Mitchell, in handcuffs, wearing orange prison uniforms. They looked so different from the elegant Sterlings I had met at the engagement party. Amanda had no makeup on, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her face pale and thin. Richard had lost that air of arrogant confidence, his shoulders slumped, staring at the floor. Catherine was crying softly, a crumpled tissue in her hand. They sat at the defense table with their lawyers. Amanda looked around the room, and when her eyes met mine, something crossed her face. Anger, yes, but also something else. Defeat, maybe. The acceptance that it was all over. The trial lasted 4 days. I heard testimony after testimony from men who had been destroyed by the Mitchells. Daniel Patterson from Salt Lake City told how Amanda had posed as an investment consultant, had won his trust after his wife died of cancer, and then had slowly drained all of his accounts. Michael Torres from Boise described how he had fallen in love with Amanda, had planned to marry her, had even bought a house for them. And then one day, she just disappeared, taken $370,000 he had transferred to a joint investment account that never existed. Story after story of confident, successful men who had been reduced to nothing by this family of predators. When it was my turn to testify, on the afternoon of the third day, I took the witness stand with my legs trembling. The prosecutor, a woman named Jennifer Wu, guided me through my testimony. I told them about meeting Victoria, about discovering her interest in Connor's money, about overhearing Richard's conversation, about draining the fund. I told them about hiring James to investigate, about discovering their real identities, about planning the public reveal. The defense attorney tried to discredit me, suggesting that I had invaded the Mitchells' privacy, that I had acted dramatically and unnecessarily. But I kept my cool. I explained that I had protected my son from dangerous criminals, that I had coordinated with the FBI, that I had done everything by the book. The judge accepted my testimony without any issue. On the fourth day, the jury went out to deliberate. It only took them 5 hours. When they came back, the foreman stood up and read the verdict. Guilty, on all charges, for all 3 of them. Amanda closed her eyes when she heard it. Richard lowered his head. Catherine sobbed loudly. The sentencing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Connor and I left the courthouse that afternoon and stood on the steps for a moment, just breathing in the fresh air, letting the weight of it all hit us. My son put his arm around my shoulders and pulled me close. He just said, "You did the right thing, Mom." And for the first time in months, I really believed it. The Mitchells' sentences were announced on a May morning. Amanda Rose Mitchell received 19 years in federal prison. Richard Mitchell got 22 years. Catherine Mitchell, who the prosecutors were able to prove had a smaller role in the schemes, received 11 years. 19 years. Amanda would get out of prison at 45 years old. Half of her adult life wasted behind bars. I read the news in the paper, sitting on the farmhouse porch with my mug of coffee, and I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I would. Just a deep sadness for the waste of it all, for the wasted talent, for the ruined lives on both sides, for the destruction that greed and dishonesty cause. But life had to go on, and slowly, things started to get back to normal. My weekly classes with Connor became the highlight of my days. He was progressing incredibly fast, soaking up knowledge like a sponge. In June, he made his first investment completely on his own. He bought shares in a small biotech company he had researched extensively. I offered advice when he asked, but I let the final decision be his. And you know what happened? 4 months later, those shares had gone up 37%. Connor had made a profit of almost $6,000 on his first independent investment. The joy on his face when he told me the news on our weekly video call was priceless. That was real pride, real accomplishment, built on true knowledge and hard work. It was around that time, on a sunny Sunday in July, that Connor gave me some news. He said he'd met someone, a woman named Rachel, who worked in the human resources department at his company. My heart skipped a beat. After Victoria, I was afraid Connor would never trust anyone again. But he assured me that this time, he was taking it slow, getting to know the person for real before getting too involved. I asked if I could meet Rachel. Connor smiled and said yes, that he actually wanted to set up a dinner for the three of us, maybe next month. That conversation filled me with hope. My son was healing. He was learning to trust again, to love again, but this time with his eyes wide open. The dinner with Rachel happened on a Friday in August at the restaurant in the Montgomery. Connor had suggested we go there because he knew it was a special place for me, and I appreciated the gesture. He was trying to include important parts of his life in mine, reconnecting the threads that had snapped that terrible engagement night almost a year ago. Rachel was completely different from Victoria. Where Victoria was all appearance and performance, Rachel was genuine. Natural brown hair, cut in a practical style, simple framed glasses, a warm smile. She'd worked in HR for 9 years, had been divorced for 4, no kids. When we greeted each other, she gave me a real hug, not that fake hug Victoria used to give. During dinner, Rachel asked me real questions about my life, about the farm, about the cattle, about how I'd learned to invest. She listened with genuine attention, asking follow-up questions that showed she really cared about the answers, and most importantly, the way she looked at Connor. There was affection there, yes, but also respect. She didn't treat him like a project or a target. She treated him like an equal, a partner. At the end of the night, as they were leaving, Rachel pulled me aside while Connor went to get the car. She said something I'll never forget. She said that Connor had told her everything about Victoria and about what I had done, and that she wanted me to know that she thought I had been incredibly brave and that any son would be lucky to have a mother willing to protect him that way. Those words, coming from someone who barely knew me, moved me more than I expected. It was around that same time that I had an idea. An idea that had been sprouting in the back of my mind for months, but suddenly crystallized into something concrete. I was at the hotel office in Louisville, reviewing the quarterly numbers with James, when he casually mentioned that a guest had asked about networking programs for women entrepreneurs. James had told her we didn't have anything like that, and the woman had been disappointed. That conversation stayed with me. I went back to the farm that night and sat on the porch thinking about my own journey, about how hard it had been to learn everything on my own, about how a mentor or a support network would have made it all so much easier, thinking about all those women out there who might be in the same situation I was in 7 years ago. Widows, divorcees, women over 50 who suddenly found themselves alone and needing to rebuild their financial lives. Women who had potential but no knowledge, who had dreams but no resources. And suddenly, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. The following Monday, I called my lawyer, a man named Thomas Bradley, who had helped me with the hotel purchase years ago. I set up a meeting for that same week. In Thomas's office, I explained my idea. I wanted to create a foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping women over 55 start over financially. The foundation would offer scholarships for education, whether it was college, technical courses, or professional training. It would also offer microloans for women wanting to start small businesses. Thomas listened carefully, taking notes. When I finished explaining, he looked at me with that appraising look that lawyers have and asked how much I was thinking of investing initially. I had thought a lot about it. I told him $600,000 as an initial endowment. $600,000. It was a huge amount, but I had over $5 million in liquid assets. I could afford to help other women without compromising my own financial security. Thomas started preparing the paperwork. We needed a name for the foundation, a clear mission, a governance structure. We spent weeks refining every detail. For the name, I chose something simple but meaningful, the Rebirth Foundation, because that's what I had done 7 years ago. I was reborn, and I wanted to give other women the same opportunity. The mission was clear: to empower women over 55 through education and financial opportunities, helping them build economic independence and security for their golden years. I told Connor about the project on one of our weekly calls. He was silent for a moment after I finished explaining, and for a second I was afraid he'd think the idea was silly or impractical. But then he smiled, that wide smile that lit up his whole face. "Mom, this is incredible. You should have done this years ago." His support meant the world to me. James was also thrilled with the idea. He offered the hotel as the foundation's headquarters, saying we could use one of the second-floor offices at no cost. He also suggested we could host networking events and workshops at the hotel, using the conference rooms. The foundation was officially established on September 1st. I hired an executive director, a brilliant woman named Sandra Torres, who had 25 years of experience in nonprofits. Sandra brought in a small but dedicated team, and together we started getting the word out about the program. The response was overwhelming. In the first 3 weeks, we received over 230 applications from women all over Kentucky and neighboring states. Widowed women wanting to go back to college and finish degrees they'd abandoned decades ago. Divorced women wanting to learn new skills to rebuild their careers. Women who had always dreamed of having their own businesses but never had the capital to start. Reading those applications broke my heart and filled me with hope at the same time, because every one of those women was me. It was the Margaret from 7 years ago, lost and scared but determined to build something new. Our first beneficiary was a 57-year-old woman named Carol Bennett. Carol had been a homemaker for 32 years, raising 5 children while her husband worked. After the kids grew up and left home, her husband left her for a younger woman. The divorce left her with almost nothing but the house. Carol had always been good with flowers. She had a beautiful garden that was the envy of the neighborhood. She dreamed of opening a landscaping business, but she didn't have the money to start or the knowledge of how to run a company. The foundation gave Carol a $12,000 grant and enrolled her in a small business management program. I also personally connected her with an established landscaper who agreed to mentor her. In 7 months, Carol opened Bennett Landscapes. She started small, just her and a helper, doing residential gardening. But the business grew quickly. People loved her work, and referrals came naturally. When I visited Carol on the first anniversary of her business, she had 4 employees and a waiting list of clients. She hugged me with tears in her eyes and said the foundation had saved her life, had given her a purpose when she thought it was too late to start over. That moment, seeing Carol beaming in the middle of the nursery she had built, that's when I knew I had made the right decision. In the following months, the foundation helped 28 more women. Some wanted formal education, and we paid for tuition and books. Others wanted vocational training, and we funded courses in nursing, accounting, graphic design. 4 women received microloans to open small businesses. Each story was unique, but the theme was always the same. Women that society had written off as too old, proving that they still had so much to offer. So much unrealized potential, just waiting to bloom. The work with the foundation gave me something I didn't know I was missing. A purpose beyond profit. Making money was good. It was important for security. But helping other women, seeing them flourish, seeing lives transformed, that was rewarding in a way no financial statement could ever be. Connor came to visit me at the farm on a weekend in October. He'd gotten a promotion at work. He was now a senior portfolio manager, and he was just beaming with pride. We talked about his investments, about his career plans, about life. And then, on a lazy afternoon on the porch, as we watched the cattle in the pasture, Connor said something that took me by surprise. He said he'd started dating Rachel seriously, that they had grown very close over the past few months. I asked if I could get to know Rachel better, maybe have a quieter dinner. Connor smiled and said yes, that actually Rachel had suggested coming to see the farm. That conversation filled me with hope. My son was truly healing. He was learning to trust again, to love again, but this time with his eyes wide open. The weekend with Rachel happened in November. She and Connor came to the farm on a Friday afternoon and stayed until Sunday. Rachel was completely different from Victoria from the very first moment. She didn't look at the farm with disdain. Instead, she was fascinated by everything: the cattle, the chickens, the simplicity of country life. She helped me in the kitchen, and we talked about everything. About her divorce, about how hard it had been to rebuild her life afterward, about the challenges of working in HR, I shared a little about my own journey after Robert died. We connected in a way I never could have with Victoria, because this connection was real, based on honesty and mutual respect. On Sunday morning, while Connor was still sleeping, Rachel and I sat on the porch with our coffee. She looked out at the fields and said something that touched me. "I get why you love this place so much. It's peaceful here. It's true. It's not about appearances or impressing anyone. It's just real." Those words showed me that she understood, that she saw value in the things that really matter. It was in December, almost a year after that terrible engagement night, that Connor called me with news. He was nervous, I could hear it in his voice. He said he had something important to tell me. My heart sped up. I waited. And then he said, "Mom, I asked Rachel to marry me. She said yes, we're engaged." This time I cried with pure joy, with relief, with gratitude that my son had found real love after everything he'd been through. I asked when the wedding would be. Connor said they wanted something small and intimate, maybe at the end of spring. They didn't want anything big or extravagant, just close family and dear friends. And then he said something that just melted me. He said they wanted to have the ceremony at the farm, if I would allow it, that Rachel loved this place, found it peaceful and beautiful, that they both wanted to start their marriage in a place that represented true roots, real values. Of course, I said yes. More than yes. I said it would be an honor. The next few months were a whirlwind of planning. Rachel and her mother, a sweet lady named Helen, would come on weekends to discuss details. We decided to have the ceremony in the back pasture with a view of the distant mountains. 80 white chairs arranged in a semicircle. Wildflowers instead of expensive arrangements. A simple but delicious buffet prepared by the chef from the Montgomery. Everything authentic. Everything real. Everything completely different from that disastrous engagement over a year ago. The wedding took place on a perfect May afternoon. The sky was a clear blue without a cloud. The temperature just right, a gentle breeze swaying the wildflowers we had planted specially for the occasion. Connor was handsome in a simple navy blue suit. Rachel was radiant in a white lace dress that had belonged to her grandmother, her hair down with flowers woven into it. When she walked down the makeshift aisle on the grass, I saw my son cry for the first time since Robert's funeral, but these were tears of pure joy. The ceremony was conducted by a local pastor who had known our family for decades. He spoke about true love, about respect, about building a life together based on honesty and partnership. Every word seemed aimed specifically at Connor and Rachel. When they exchanged the vows they had written, when Connor promised to respect and honor Rachel every day, when Rachel promised to support and love Connor in all circumstances, I couldn't hold back my tears. Dylan, Connor's best friend who had been there through the toughest times, was the best man. Rachel's sister was the maid of honor. Everything simple, everything perfect. At the reception afterward, while people ate and danced and celebrated, Connor pulled me aside. He held my hands and looked me in the eye with that seriousness he used to have as a child when he wanted to say something important. And he said, "Mom, thank you for protecting me when I was too blind to protect myself, for teaching me when I was ready to learn, for never giving up on me, even when I was unfair to you. You're the strongest woman I know, and I hope that one day, if Rachel and I have children, I'll be half the parent you were to me." I hugged my son right there, in the middle of the party, and I cried on his shoulder like I hadn't cried in years. They were tears of relief, of joy, of gratitude that we had made it to this point, that we had survived the storm and come out stronger on the other side. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the newlyweds had left for their honeymoon, I stood alone on the porch, looking out at the field where the ceremony had taken place. The white chairs were still there, pale ghosts in the moonlight. The flowers swayed in the night breeze, and I thought about the whole journey. From that terrible day when Robert died, through all the tough decisions, all the mistakes, all the victories, all the way to here, to this moment of peace. Life hadn't been easy. It had been brutal at times, but it had been worth it. Every difficult moment, every impossible decision, every night crying alone in the dark. It had all led to this, to my son, happy with a good woman, to a foundation changing lives, to a legacy that went beyond money, to a life that had meaning. The summer passed in a happy blur. The foundation had now helped over 60 women. The results were impressive. Sandra would show me monthly reports with success statistics that were just incredible. But the story that touched me the most that summer was that of a woman named Susan Moore. Susan was 61 when she applied to the foundation. She had been a high school music teacher for 38 years, until the school where she worked closed due to budget cuts. Divorced for a decade, with no children, Susan suddenly found herself unemployed and struggling to pay the bills on her small pension. But Susan had a dream. She had always wanted to open a community music school, a place where children from low-income families could learn instruments for free or at affordable prices. She had the passion, she had the experience, but she didn't have the startup capital or the knowledge of how to run a business. The foundation gave Susan an $18,000 grant and enrolled her in a nonprofit management program. I also personally connected her with James, who had management experience, and offered to mentor her. In 8 months, Susan opened the Melody Arts Academy in a rented building in downtown Louisville. She started with 12 students. By the end of the first year, she had 70, all children from families who could never have afforded private music lessons. When I went to the school's end-of-year performance in June, I sat in the auditorium and watched those children playing violins, flutes, pianos. Some were clearly talented, others were still learning, but all of them were beaming, proud, happy. And Susan was on stage, coordinating everything with a smile so big it lit up the whole room. After the performance, she found me backstage. She didn't say anything, just hugged me tight and cried on my shoulder. I understood. No words were necessary. That school was her life's dream, and the foundation had made it possible. It was in July that Connor and Rachel gave me the news. We were having dinner at the Montgomery on a Friday night, just the three of us, when Rachel suddenly got nervous, looking at Connor with that look that says, "You tell her, or I will." Connor smiled, took her hand across the table and said, "Mom, we're having a baby. Rachel is 10 weeks pregnant." For a second, I couldn't process it. I just stared at them, my mouth open, my brain trying to understand the words. A baby. I was going to be a grandmother. And then I just burst into tears. Happy tears, laughing and crying at the same time, getting up from my chair to hug them, making a scene in the elegant restaurant that made other diners look. But I didn't care one bit. My son was going to be a father. He was going to have a child. Robert was going to have a grandchild, even if he would never get to meet them. That night was one of the happiest of my life. The months of Rachel's pregnancy passed in a mix of anxiety and anticipation. I wanted to be involved, but not intrusive. I wanted to help, but not smother. I tried to find the balance between an enthusiastic grandmother and respect in their space. Rachel was kind and inclusive. She invited me to the ultrasounds, sent me pictures of her growing belly, asked for my advice on baby gear. We became closer during those months than we ever had been. We found out it would be a girl in December. A little girl that Connor and Rachel decided to name Lily Rose. Lily because Rachel had always loved lilies. Rose for my grandmother's middle name, the same grandmother who had left me the pearl necklace. When Connor told me about the name, about how they wanted to honor the family, I had to leave the room for a moment to compose myself. That gesture of connection, of recognizing the family line, meant everything. Lily Rose was born on a cold March morning, 2 weeks early. Rachel went into labor at 4 in the morning, and Connor called me in an absolute panic from the road on the way to the hospital. I drove from Louisville to Cincinnati in record time, probably breaking several traffic laws in the process. I got to the hospital at 7 in the morning. The labor lasted another 6 hours. I waited in the waiting room, pacing back and forth, unable to sit, unable to relax. And then, finally, Connor came out of the delivery room with tears streaming down his face and a smile so big it looked like it was going to split in two. He just said, "Mom, come meet your granddaughter." I walked into that hospital room and saw Rachel in the bed, tired but radiant, holding a tiny little bundle wrapped in pink blankets. She looked up when I came in and smiled, motioning for me to come closer. I approached the bed slowly, like I was walking on sacred ground, and then I looked down. Lily Rose was perfect. tiny, red, with a thick head of dark hair. Her eyes were closed, her little hands clenched into tiny fists. Beautiful in a way that made my heart ache. Rachel asked if I wanted to hold her. With shaken hands, I held out my arms. Rachel carefully placed that baby in my arms, and her weight, so light but so significant, almost buckled my knees. I looked at that perfect little face and thought about everything. About Robert, who would never know this granddaughter. About the whole journey that had brought me to this moment. About all the decisions, good and bad, that had resulted in this new life, this continuation of the family. Lily opened her eyes for a second. They were blue, the color of a summer sky. She looked at me with that seriousness that babies have, as if she was sizing up who this person holding her was. And then she closed her little eyes again and yawned. That tiny baby yawn that is the most adorable thing in the world. I stood there holding my granddaughter, with Connor on one side and Rachel on the other, and I thought, this is what it was all for. Not the money, not the hotel, not the foundation, as important as it was. This moment, this family, this love. The months after Lily's birth were an adjustment for everyone. Connor and Rachel were dealing with sleepless nights, endless diapers, breastfeeding, the whole reality of being first-time parents. I tried to help when I could, driving to Cincinnati on weekends to give them a break, taking care of Lily so they could get a few hours of uninterrupted sleep, holding that little baby, feeling her weight in my arms, listening to those tiny noises she made while she slept, filled me with a joy I didn't know I could still feel. Being a grandmother was different from being a mother. It had all the joy without all the constant pressure and responsibility. I could just love that child without worry, knowing her parents were good, responsible, dedicated. The foundation continued to grow. By the summer of that year, we had helped 120 women. Sandra showed me impact studies that were just incredible. 94% of the women who received grants were employed or self-employed a year later. Their average income had increased by 63%. But more than numbers, it was the stories. Like the 65-year-old woman who had gone back to college after 42 years and had graduated with honors. Like the 58-year-old woman who had opened a daycare and now employed 10 people. Like the 62-year-old woman who had started a financial consultant service specifically for other older women. Each story was a small miracle, a life transformed, a potential realized. It was on an afternoon in September, when Lily was 6 months old, that I received an unexpected letter. The return address was Amanda Mitchell, from the federal prison where she was serving her sentence. I stared at that envelope for a long time before opening it. Part of me wanted to throw it away without reading. But curiosity won. The letter was surprisingly short. Amanda didn't try to apologize or make excuses. She just said she'd had a lot of time to think during her months in prison, that she was in mandatory therapy, that she was starting to understand the damage she had caused. And then she said something that surprised me. She said she wanted me to know that on some twisted level, she really had liked Connor, that he was different from the other targets, kinder, more genuine, that if circumstances had been different, if she hadn't been who she was, maybe it could have been real. But she admitted that didn't change anything, that she had chosen to be who she was, to do what she did, and now she was paying the price. The last line of the letter said, "You protected your son from me. You did what any good mother would do. I hope that someday, if I ever have children, I'll be half the mother you are." I folded the letter and put it in my desk drawer. I didn't know what to do with those words, how to process them. Part of me wanted to believe that some redemption was possible for Amanda. Another part knew that words are easy when you're locked up and facing 19 years. I didn't answer the letter. There was nothing I could say. Lily grew up fast, from the wobbly steps of a 6-month-old to a curious 1-year-old, starting to walk, falling and getting back up with fierce determination. She had Connor's stubbornness and Rachel's sweetness, a combination that was going to make her a force of nature when she grew up. We had a small party for her first birthday at Connor and Rachel's house, just close family. Helen, Rachel's mother, was there, Dylan and his wife too. When we sang happy birthday, and she destroyed her first cake with her little hands, smearing pink frosting everywhere, I looked around that room. I looked at my son, with the wife he loved, at my granddaughter covered in cake, at the friends and family who had stuck by through the hard times. And I thought of Robert. I thought how he would have loved to be there, to see his son as a father, to meet his granddaughter. I missed him with a physical ache that still caught me by surprise sometimes, even after almost 10 years. But I also felt gratitude, because if Robert hadn't died, I never would have found this version of myself. I never would have discovered that I could be strong on my own, smart with business, capable of building an empire. It's a terrible truth, but it's true. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us end up leading to the best outcomes. Not because suffering is good, but because it forces us to become something more. It was in October that I got a call from Agent Martinez at the FBI. He informed me that Amanda Mitchell was being considered for early parole. She had served 3 years of a 19-year sentence, had exemplary behavior in prison, had completed rehabilitation programs, and the parole board was reviewing her case. As one of the affected victims, I had the right to send a statement about whether I thought she should be released or not. I thought about that phone call for days. Part of me wanted to say no, that she deserved to serve every single day of her sentence, that she had destroyed too many lives and needed to pay the full price. But another part, a part that had grown and changed over the last few years, wasn't so sure. I talked to Connor about it. He was surprised I was even considering supporting her parole. He reminded me of everything she'd done, how she'd lied, manipulated, tried to destroy his life. But then Rachel, who was listening to the conversation while nursing Lily, said something that made me think. She said that people change, that 3 years is a long time, that if Amanda had genuinely reformed, keeping her locked up for another 16 years served no one. I thought about it for a whole week, and then I wrote my statement to the parole board. I said that Amanda had indeed caused harm, that she had tried to destroy my son, that her actions had consequences that lasted long after the initial crime. But I also said that I believed in redemption, that I believed people could change, that if she had genuinely reformed, if she had completed the programs, if she showed real remorse, then maybe she deserved a second chance. Under strict supervision, with strict parole, but a chance. I sent the statement and tried not to think about it anymore. The board's decision came 6 weeks later. Amanda Mitchell would be released on parole in December with strict conditions. She couldn't leave the state of Kentucky. She had to report to a parole officer weekly. She had to maintain steady employment. Any violation would result in an immediate return to prison to serve the rest of her sentence. When Connor found out, he was quiet for a long time. Then he asked if I was scared, if I thought she'd try something. Honestly, no. I thought Amanda had learned her lesson. And besides, what could she do? I was no longer the naive widow she had imagined. I was an established businesswoman with resources and connections. If she tried anything, she'd be caught immediately. December came and went. Amanda was released, and according to Agent Martinez, she had gotten a job as a receptionist at a small company in Lexington. She was living in a halfway house, following all the rules. I had no contact with her. I didn't want any. That chapter was closed. But then, on a January afternoon, almost 4 years after that disastrous engagement party, I got a call from Sandra at the foundation. She was excited, her voice practically jumping through the line. We had just received a huge anonymous donation, $600,000, the largest single donation the foundation had ever received. $600,000. With that money, we could double the number of women we helped next year. We could expand to other states like I'd always dreamed. We could make an even bigger difference. I asked Sandra if she had any idea who the anonymous donor was. She said no, only that the money had come through a trust fund with very specific instructions that it should be used for education scholarships for low-income women over 55. Something about those specific instructions sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. 3 days later, I received a letter. It had no return address, just a postmark from Lexington, Kentucky. I opened it with slightly shaken hands, already knowing somehow who it was from before I even saw the signature. Amanda Mitchell. The letter was short. She explained that she'd gotten a better job 7 months ago at an accounting firm that was willing to give someone with a criminal record a chance, that she was saving every penny she could, that she had sold everything she owned of value, and that she had donated it all to my foundation. She wrote, "You showed me it's never too late to be someone different. I destroyed lives. You build lives. I can't undo what I did, but I can try to build something good with the time I have left. This money is a drop in the ocean compared to the damage I caused, but it's a start. I hope it helps other women find the path you found. I hope that one day, if I work hard enough, live honestly enough, I can look in the mirror and see someone decent. Thank you for showing me it's possible to start over." I stared at that letter for a long time. $600,000. Amanda had saved $600,000 working as a receptionist and an accountant? Impossible. Unless... I called Agent Martinez. He confirmed what I suspected. Amanda had contacted 4 of her previous victims, had confessed in person, and had made restitution agreements. She was paying back, slowly but consistently, the money she had stolen years ago. The $600,000 came from one of those restitution agreements that she had directed to the foundation instead of keeping for herself. She was genuinely trying to do things differently. I don't know what I felt about that. Relief? Satisfaction? Sadness for the lost time? Maybe all of it at once. But I decided to believe her. To believe that people can change. They have to be able to, otherwise what hope is there for any of us? It was that same month that Connor made the decision to leave his job in Cincinnati. He and Rachel had talked extensively, done the math, planned carefully. With Lily growing up, they wanted a life with more flexibility, more family time. Connor would become a formal partner in my investments, working part-time to help me manage the portfolio and the foundation. This would give him time to be present in Lily's life in a way many fathers can't. Rachel would continue working in HR, but also remotely part of the time. And they were going to move. To where, you ask? To the farmhouse 3 miles from my farm that had been empty since the owners retired and moved to Florida. My son was coming home. To the country he had grown up thinking he wanted to escape. But now, with the perspective of years and experience, he saw the value of that lifestyle. The peace, the simplicity, the connection to nature. The move happened in June. I spent weeks helping Rachel organize the new house, painting rooms, putting together furniture. Lily would have her own huge yard to play in. She would grow up with cattle and chickens and open skies, just like her father. The first night they slept in the new house, I visited them for dinner. We sat on their porch, which had a view of the same fields my porch did, just from a different angle. Lily was running on the lawn, chasing fireflies that were starting to appear in the dusk. Connor looked at me with a smile that was half embarrassed, half proud. "Mom, I spent so long wanting to escape from here, thinking the city was where I needed to be successful. But now I see, success isn't about where you are. It's about who you are, what you build, the people you love." I held my son's hand, and we watched our granddaughter play on the lawn, and I felt a circle completin'. The following years were the best of my life. The foundation grew and prospered, eventually expanding to 4 other states. We helped over 500 women in total, 500 transformed lives, 500 stories of new beginnings. The hotel continued to be successful, now managed almost entirely by James, with minimal input from me. I had learned to delegate, to trust other people to run what I had built. My investments grew steadily under the partnership with Connor. He had a real talent for it, an instinct for the market that only got better with time. Eventually, when I was 68, I officially transferred primary management to him. I was still involved, still made the big decisions, but he ran the day-to-day operations. And he was doing incredibly well. Lily grew up, from the wobbly steps of a 1-year-old to a curious, intelligent 4-year-old, as stubborn as her father and as sweet as her mother. She loved the cattle, loved helping to feed them, loved brushing them with that seriousness that children bring to tasks they think are important. And then, when Lily was 3, Rachel gave me the news that they were expecting another baby. This time a boy, who they decided to name Robert, for my husband, to honor the grandfather he would never know but whose legacy continued through all of us. Robert was born on a spring morning, strong and healthy, crying with powerful lungs that promised a vibrant personality. When I held my grandson for the first time, looking at that little face that somehow already looked like my late husband, I cried. I cried for everything Robert had missed by dying too young. But I also cried with gratitude because somehow, through this baby, he lived on. On a summer afternoon, when baby Robert was 8 months old and Lily was 5, the whole family came to the farm for a barbecue. Connor and Rachel, the kids, Dylan and his wife who had gotten married the year before, James from the hotel with his husband, Sandra from the foundation, some of the beneficiary women who had become friends over the years. It was a perfect afternoon. Blue sky without a cloud, ideal temperature, a gentle breeze. The children played on the lawn. The adults talked and laughed, sharing food and stories. And I stood there on my porch, watching it all, and I thought about the whole journey. 10 years. 10 years since Robert died and my old life ended. 10 years of building something new from scratch, of learning, growing, failing, succeeding, failing again, succeeding again, of protecting my son even when he hated me for it, of building a fortune I never imagined having, of helping hundreds of women start their lives over, of discovering that you're never too old, it's never too late, it's never too impossible. Victoria Sterling had called me the stinky farm woman. She had thought I was a nobody, a simpleton they could manipulate and discard. And you know what? I was the farm woman. I still am. I still live on the same farm, still take care of the same cattle, still watch the same sunsets from the same porch. But a nobody? I was never a nobody. I was the woman who built a financial empire that nobody knew existed, who bought a hotel and turned it into the most elegant in the city, who created a foundation that changed hundreds of lives, who protected her son from predators and then taught him how to protect himself, who became a grandmother and a mentor and a businesswoman and a philanthropist, all while still feeding chickens every morning and tending to the cattle every afternoon. The irony of it all, the delicious irony that still makes me smile, is that while Amanda and her family were busy looking down, judging me, underestimating me, I was busy building the world they were living in. They planned to steal $385,000 from a fund I had created in a hotel I owned at a party I was paying for, from the woman who had more money in the bank than they would ever see in their lives. And when it all came crashing down, when the truth came out, they lost everything. Their freedom, their reputation, years of their lives. And me? I gained everything that truly mattered. Lily ran up to the porch just then, her cheeks pink from playing in the sun, her dark hair flying behind her. She climbed into my lap, all sharp elbows and knees and endless energy. Grandma, can you teach me to brush Bessie again? Please? I held my granddaughter, felt her warm, living weight, and said yes, of course I would. We went down to the corral together, Lily holding my hand with that absolute trust that children have that you will always be there for them. And as I taught her how to groom the cow with long, gentle strokes, as I listened to her hum to herself, as I felt the warm sun on my back and the familiar smell of hay and earth, I thought, this is success. Right here. Not the money in the bank, though it's nice to have security. Not the hotel or the foundation or the investments, though they are important and meaningful. But this moment, teaching my granddaughter how to care for an animal, having my son living nearby, knowing I helped other women find their way, knowing I built something that will last beyond me. This is success, and nobody, absolutely nobody, can ever take that away from me. Today, I still live on the same farm in rural Kentucky, where I raised my son and lived with my husband for so many years. Amanda Mitchell is on parole in Lexington, working an honest job, trying to rebuild a life based on truth this time. Her father is still in prison. Her mother was released for good behavior a year ago. They lost everything they tried to steal from me and my son. They lost years of freedom. They lost their reputation. They lost any chance they had at normal lives. I learned that you should never underestimate someone based on their appearance. I learned that strength comes in unexpected forms. I learned that it's possible to start over at any age, to build something new from nothing, to turn tragedy into triumph. And I learned that sometimes the family you rebuild after loss is just as strong as the family you lost, Different, but just as precious. So, what would you have done in my place? Do you think I did the right thing? Let me know in the comments what city you're listening from. And if you enjoyed my story, please give the video a like so the channel can keep bringing you more stories like this. Thank you for all the love. On the screen, you'll see another story I'm sure you're gonna love. Go on and click it to watch. Oh, and if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, don't forget to subscribe. All right? Until the next story.